Hey folks, welcome back to the Cotswold Collectibles YouTube channel. I am Greg Brown, president of Cotswold Collectibles. We've been doing an ongoing series on our YouTube channel about the vintage line of action figures and the variations related to that. G.I. Joe, Falcone, Action Man, Guyper Man, you name it. This week, we're going to be tackling the figures that came out of Japan under the Takara name. And I'll let Ace take it from here.
Okay, so Takara was based in Japan, and they're a really fascinating story. They came and licensed G.I. Joe, and I'm not sure if they were one of the manufacturers or whatever, or how that worked out, but when they first licensed G.I. Joe, they actually released G.I. Joe figures exactly like they were in the United States.
Right.
The boxes have slightly different printing on them, the figure boxes. And what was really interesting too, is they would put a figure box with like a dress marine in it, or a astronaut figure in it with the silver suit on. And, but again, those boxes are slightly different. And then they had the same large window cards, but they would have a Japanese manual in it, and then like a little tiny little card, like a little strip thing that was wrapped over it to kind of show them.
We had a few come through here.
Yeah, really neat products. Really. But you know, it's true. I mean, come on. G.I. Joe was made in Japan. They were taking the stuff from the same factory and just putting putting the manual in different, and then putting this little corner wrap on it.
Right.
And so those were the first Takara G.I. Joes. And then I'm not exactly sure what year the first the unique Takara G.I. Joe came out. I believe it was the late 60s. So we can just say the later 60s this one came out. And what they did is they had a whole unique head sculpt. The body style is somewhat the same. The hands are completely different. Instead of being the nose picker hands, which the first figures were, they were like a precursor to the Kung Fu grip.
Yeah, have a gripping.
They kind of have a gripping hand, but they're a little stiff. It's more of that stiffer plastic. It's not as soft as the rubber that we're used to with Kung Fu grip, but it's a really interesting, unique hand sculpt. And this is the only figure that has that. One thing I noticed about Takara figures is they get really loose really easy. So maybe the elastic isn't that great, but they just tend to be kind of like loose, sloppy figures. So, and then they have a unique butt marks on them that say Takara, but they are marked on the butt. And they have painted rivets and all that kind of stuff. But it's a great figure with a unique head sculpt. It's
almost, when you're looking at it, at least from the back, it looks to me like the torso is a little bit smaller, as well as the buttocks and stuff like that. I don't know if I know those are the two first things that grabbed my attention. So I almost wondered if they're just maybe a little bit shorter than the G.I. Joe that came before them.
I don't know. You can find a Joe here and find out. Nope.
About the same.
About the same. But again, you get an idea that it's
just a little bit more,
a little bit different. But the chest is not quite as large.
Right.
I certainly agree with that. So.
And the head, definitely, if you're familiar at all with like manga or anime, they have the very pronounced eyes that would be more recognizable within the Japanese market with the whole anime.
They have a far more anime look, and that's a great way to look at it. And then I believe it was when the flocking came out. So let's guess about 1970. They came out with their own flocked G.I. Joe. And it's essentially the same, as you can tell, it's the same anime head. We'll call that the anime head.
Right.
And they put some flocking on it. But what's really interesting to me is there's never a real mustache on the guy. It's like they almost don't flock the under the nose properly.
So he almost has an Amish beard?
It almost has the Amish beard. Almost, though, but just a very little bit. And that's just kind of been a consistent thing. But the hand style is the same. The markings are the same. The body style is the same. And then what they did about that same time is they had some really amazing uniforms and sets. And they did a line of Germans that were pretty interesting. They had a Panzer commander. They had a couple officers that were German soldiers that were really high quality, different uniforms. They also did, a bunch of karate stuff, and they did baseball uniforms.
Yeah,
super cool.
They loved baseball.
But the foreign figures that they did for their German soldiers is they did this head sculpt for it. Again, the body style is the same, but the different unique head sculpt. And this is the early 70s foreign figure, I would call it. Now, What's ironic is they never had a Japanese imperial soldier. But they did certainly sell Germans, and from the World War II era and all that stuff.
That is interesting.
It is just kind of interesting. But anyway, we're not here to be political. But the whole idea is the butt markings are the same on these 3 different figures.
Right.
They say Takara on them.
And in English, too.
And in English, yeah. It's a great point. It is in English.
It's in English.
Now, in the early 80s, I'm not exactly sure how long this went. I'm assuming until the late 70s. But in the early 80s, they reissued a group of figures that with a slightly different body style, with more of a kung fu grip hand and a completely unique head sculpt. Now, they had a American soldier, a German soldier, and a police officer.
Right.
And some of these parts and pieces were model kits. Like the police officer was actually a kit that you put together and you would paint on your own if you wanted to get the helmet painted.
Right.
And they could, at that same time, they also did model kits of an M16, a Schmeiser, and a Tommy gun. And those are the 3 guns that they did. And they also did a couple accessory cards that were really, really cool, high detailed, great German helmets and that kind of stuff. And even the U.S. soldier, I thought that they did, had a great, like a tack jacket that was different than anything. And it's really, really cool.
Yeah, the U.S. soldiers, the one, although they had the modern U.S. soldier that actually had the woodland camouflage.
Absolutely.
And they had the World War II one that had the M41 jacket and the pants and the Thompson ammo pouch. And it was one of the first ones I ever got.
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
The detail was phenomenal compared to what you had back from the 60s and 70s from any of the military lines. They were very more toy-like, whereas these were a lot more accurate, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I think that's a fantastic way to put it. And the markings on this, there's nothing on the butt. They actually have a very narrow waist, but the back says Takara Japan in English on it. And they're a pretty sturdy figure too. They're generally pretty well made. Now, Takara is a really interesting company.
Yes, they are.
And Takara has a whole lot to do with the future of G.I. Joe and Transformers.
Mm-hmm.
Takara invented Transformers. And what very few people know is that G.I. Joe is the daddy of the Transformers. There is an actual figure that is a part using an actual G.I. Joe torso shot in clear that goes into a motorcycle that is a motorcycle pieces and parts, really the first Transformer. They also make this clear robot, which obviously uses the same structure of the body and the body style of G.I. Joe. And it has this little head that removes, that goes on, and I guess that's the computer brain.
That's the computer brain. Mm-hmm.
Now, where it gets really interesting is there are multiple uniforms that you can get that are very anime style, very futuristic style that would fit onto this figure.
Quite a few of them are actually very kaiju themed because of the whole kaiju monsters and fighters and stuff like that. So I think they had some kaiju themed figures as well as any other type of Japanese superhero per se.
Well, there's a really amazing figure that maybe some of you have seen that has a late issue Takara figure with dark hair, and he's inside a Godzilla costume. Awesome.
Right.
Awesome set.
Yeah.
And you pull the head off and there's G.I. Joe underneath there.
It's just like how the real guy would wear it in one scale.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if you're doing the special effects. There also is a series of Japanese figures that have like a lion head, mm-hmm. and there's like other kind of robot-y type heads, and those are really unique. And I have a couple of them, and I'm just learning about those, but I don't really feel comfortable enough to talk about them.
Yeah, what was interesting about Henshin Cyborg was it was almost kind of like the Captain Action of the line.
Yeah.
Because Captain Action had all those different aliases or costumes, and that's where they really took off with those. It's like you talk about the ones, the lion heads and this and that. And then they had the removable hands where you could have claws and other different appendages.
Yeah, there'd be like a rubber glove that you'd pop on instead. That was different.
It was very adaptable. Are you familiar with how the lineage happens between G.I. Joe and Transformers?
Tell us.
Okay. I've studied this because Henshin Cyborg is kind of my thing that I've been really studying. So basically, Hasbro licenses the product to Takara. They call it, Combat Joe. And then what they do is it evolves until you get to this clear body, which is Henshin Cyborg. And then, like Ace said, they actually had one that Henshin Cyborg, the body, you take it apart and basically morphs into this motorcycle. Very unusual. Well, what happened is in the mid to late 70s, they did a line of figures called Microman. And they shortened them down a little bit. And in the US, people are familiar with them called Micronauts.
Yeah.
Which was what Microman was licensed out to Mego. Not Hasbro, but to Mego. They did Micronauts. So they had that, and they had their whole line of figures and this and that, and whole futuristic thing. Then they decided, let's take it smaller. So the next evolution of the Microman were these little silver figures, and they fit inside of cars or vehicles that would transform. And so you had they weren't called Transformers there. They were called, it was like Diaclone and these other ones. And so then what happened was the little figures, which are supposed to be representations of this, but smaller in these vehicles, Hasbro comes along, we're looking for something new and hot. They contact Takara, and basically they take all they pick and choose the Takara, because if you noticed, there were the ones with the figures. There was the one, the one with the gun, the as I call it, the Man from U.N.C.L.E. gun, which eventually ended up becoming Megatron.
Yeah.
So that was a whole different line, and then they combined those worlds together. So basically, Hasbro created the line, then it evolved through Takara, and then Takara ended up licensing their brand back to Hasbro. So it had become full circle. So he would be like the grandfather, because it was that Microman, and then I think it was like Diaclone, and there's like 3 different names that they borrowed from. Because robots back in the 80s, transforming robots, that was between G.I. Joe and He-Man, that was the stuff.
The cool thing.
So
thanks, that was awesome.
Yeah. I learned that from there. Anything else?
No, man.
I'm sorry. I digress.
No, that's great.
Yeah, it's really cool. Make sure if you get out to Google Henshin Cyborg. They also had these in a very smaller scale in England through, it was something Dennis, I forget what it was called.
Yeah.
They called it Muton and something like that. And they're a little bit smaller. They're not, I don't think, Mego size, but it's a really interesting. But if you ever want to dive down a rabbit hole, dive into Henshin Cyborg. It's a totally different world, and it's an amazing thing. So, but anyway, that wraps up this week's episode. We have one episode left, if I'm correct, and it is Canada.
Oh, Canada.
So we will be wearing our our RMCP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police uniforms. Actually, not really. But just tune in next week. Make sure that you leave any comments below. We're always open for ideas and comments. We're learning like you are. And we do not promise to be the end-all, know-all about this type of stuff.
Absolutely not.
Make sure that you do subscribe to our page so that you get updates when the next videos come out. And we'll see you next week with Canadian G.I. Joes.